Just because you have read some of the Bible, it doesn't mean that you know what it says. I really try not to argue with people on the internet anymore, especially people who don't have any clue what the Bible actually says or how to find its context, or worse yet, don't care and try to make the Bible look like a bad, horrible book just because they don't like it or care to understand what it says. We're going to watch a video together that got 2.8 million views. And the person that made this video is completely ignorant of what the Bible actually says. We're going to watch it and then address all the inaccurate things she said.
The Bible says that none of us are good. The Bible also says that women aren't allowed to speak in church. The Bible also says that people with disabilities cannot approach God. The Bible also says to stone women who aren't virgins when they get married. The Bible also says to take your disobedient children out to the streets and let all the neighbors stone them to death. The Bible also says that if two men are fighting and one of their wives sees it happening and goes to defend her husband, she's to have her hand cut off. The Bible also says that without the shedding of blood, God can't forgive sin. The Bible also says to walk up to neighboring cities that don't belong to the nations nearby and to either enslave them or kill them all, and then take the women and children as plunder. The Bible also says that you should be stoned to death if you accidentally work on a Saturday. The Bible also says that unless you hate your mom, your dad, your sister, your brother, and yourself, you can't serve Jesus. The Bible also says that if you look at someone with lust, you should rip out your own eyes. The Bible also says that if someone steals from you, you should give them more things to steal from you. The Bible also says that if somebody is attacking you, to let them continue attacking you. Don't fight back. The Bible also says happy is the one who takes your infants and dashes their skulls into rocks. So why again should I care what the Bible says?
Well, you clearly don't care what the Bible says, which is why you misquoted absolutely everything in it. Let's start with 1 Timothy chapter 2. First of all, this letter is from one church leader to another church leader about how to lead their congregation. If you don't like it, don't go to it. And all of this is about how women should conduct themselves with self-control and not worry about gussing themselves up with fancy clothing or jewelry. That's pretty good advice to anybody that has morals. But let's address the part you're talking about. I do not permit a woman to teach or exercise authority over a man. Rather, she is to remain quiet. Let's get a little backstory here. Paul was writing to Timothy, who was leading the church at Ephesus. If we jump over to Acts 19, we can learn a little bit more about what this region believed. But when they recognized that he was a Jew, for about 2 hours they all cried out with one voice, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." And when the town clerk had quieted the crowd, he said, "Men of Ephesus, who is there who does not know that the city of the Ephesians is a temple keeper of the great Artemis?" Artemis is a female god, also known as Diana. With all the information that we have, it's a pretty safe assumption that this region was governed by feminism, which I'm sure the creator of this video is all about. However, feminism is completely 100% anti-biblical. It destroys God's order. And it's also why many homes across the world are destroyed. People don't even realize that going outside of the order that God ordained for a family destroys that family. And you wonder why divorce rates are so high. I'm not going to go into feminism being a man, but I encourage you to watch videos like this.
Feminism is a scam. Let me tell you why. I grew up in a household that was dominated by a strong, independent woman, and she always preached that we need to be strong, independent women too, and we should never depend on a man. I grew up with that mentality. I was a feminist myself. And one day I decided, that's a scam. I've been tricked. I've been told my whole life that I was supposed to have 2 full-time jobs, that I was
We're not going to watch the full video, but I encourage many of you to go look up videos from this woman or others like her that realize that feminism destroys the family unit and is good for absolutely nobody. So with that in mind, Paul had very good reason to tell people in his church to make sure that women, feminists, weren't exercising authority over men because it's not biblical and it destroys everything. But I'm sure many people don't even care about this context. But I digress. It is what it is. If you don't like our churches and the rules of our God, don't go to them. And don't claim that you know anything about them when you clearly don't. Next, she brings up Leviticus 21 and says that people with disabilities aren't allowed to go near God. Again, completely 100% out of context, and she has no idea what she's talking about. Pay attention to who is being spoken to. Speak to Aaron. Who is Aaron? He leads the Levitical priests. All of the Levites are of his line. Whenever the Torah says speak to Aaron, it's talking to Levitical priests alone and giving them instructions. And God says people with disabilities aren't allowed to be priests in his temple. Well, guess what? It's his temple. He can allow whoever he wants in it. But this has absolutely nothing to do with salvation. And the way she quoted it, 100,000,000% out of context. Acts 10, so Peter opened his mouth and said, "Truly I understand that God shows no partiality, but every nation, anyone who fears him and does what is right is acceptable to him." Do you know what anyone means? It means anyone, those with disabilities or not. Just because you can't serve in the temple doesn't mean you won't be saved. Next, she brings up stoning virgins in Deuteronomy 22. And the laws governing this section of the Bible fall under sexual immorality. It doesn't seem that most women in our culture care about being pure or keeping their virginity intact or about not sleeping around. But a woman keeping her virginity intact for the man that she was promised to marry was a very sacred thing. This entire section is about a woman claiming to be a virgin to the man she's supposed to marry and then not being a virgin. Which means she committed adultery against the man she was going to marry, which is punishable by death. And because our society is filled with a bunch of no-good cheaters, I'm sure many out there watching this would be like, so what, that's horrible, you shouldn't punish adulterers because you're an adulterer and you don't like it. But for those of you that have had your heart ripped out of your chest because of a cheater, I'm sure you wanted retribution at some point, and God gives retribution for that, even though our society no longer does. God still thinks it's an outrageous thing to whore around and cheat on people. And you know what? So do I. And if you're being honest with yourself, so do you. So just because you don't like the punishment doesn't mean it's not valid. Next, she brings up stoning disobedient children. She made it seem like it's speaking about children like this. But it's not. It's talking about children like that. You see, if we just read a little bit and use some brain power, you can see that it's talking about children that are gluttons and drunkards. If your little child is a drunkard, you are the one that needs to be drug out into the streets and stoned. This is talking about adult children who are drunks in the underbelly of society. People who refuse to do any work or anything at all. That law in the Bible was to prevent stuff like this from going on in the cities of God. California, New York, and Chicago might not care to have entire city blocks filled with degenerates like this, but God didn't want that in his city, and I don't blame him. Then she brings up a woman's hand being cut off for trying to defend her husband. But if you do just the tiniest bit of research, you'll find out that that's not exactly what's going on here. This is talking about a woman who damaged a man's ability to reproduce. So my feminist friend, if someone came up and punched you in the guts and you couldn't have kids anymore, would you want there to be a punishment for that person? Because that's what this is talking about. Then she talks about no forgiveness without the shedding of blood. Perhaps the only thing she didn't misquote. But why is that? Let's jump back to Leviticus and read this. For the life of the flesh is in the blood, and I have given it to you on the altar to make atonement for your souls. For it is the blood that makes atonement by the life. Whether you agree with it or not, everyone has broken God's laws that deserves death. Meaning that you must pay your life, blood, for these sins. And the only thing that could pay your fine is someone who doesn't have blood guilt on them. That's where Jesus comes in. Because you can't pay your debt to God. Only Jesus can. That's why you need to accept him into your life and start doing what the Bible asks. And stop being a lawbreaker who does stupid, ignorant stuff like try to turn people away from the Bible when they don't know what it says. And I'm sorry if I come off as sounding mean, but you don't get to talk about my God and his son the way this woman did and think that it's okay and that you don't deserve to get rebuked publicly. Speaking of, make sure you watch part 2 because we're not done yet.